Hello and welcome to lesson 3. So we're going to talk today about how to graph our equations of a line, but instead of graphing by pointing our y or plotting our y-intercept first, we are going to graph actually by using our y and our x-intercepts. So we need to have a solid understanding of a few definitions here. So the first one is x-intercept. So we need to know that our x-intercept is actually where that line crosses the x-axis. And remember that if this is my graph, this is my x, this is my y. So basically we're saying our x-intercept is anywhere where our line crosses this axis. So the other one that we need to learn is y-intercept. And again, we know these words. So y-intercept, is going to be whenever we have a line crossing our y-axis. So if this was my graph again, then whenever our equation of a line is crossing this axis, the vertical axis, okay? So let's just go through here and let's label our x and y coordinates of the x and y intercepts of the following graph. So all I'm wanting is an ordered pair, so it goes x then y, and I want to first find my x-intercept and then my y-intercept, okay? So if I'm looking at this line, I always like to start by labeling my axes so I have a reference. And you can just go through and label all of these right now. So if I'm looking at this, I'm going to look at my equation of the line. I'm going to look at here, and I'm looking for where it crosses this x-axis. So that's right here at 4. Okay? So that's where it's crossing. Now, if my line is crossing there, I know my x point, we just said it's actually at 4. So if this is my x point, then that's 4. What's my y? Well, if I'm looking here and I'm looking for a y value, I notice that there's no vertical, there's no up, there's no down. And if I go across, well, my y coordinate is 0. There's no height. Okay, so my y coordinate is 0. So now let's look at my y-axis. So if I'm going along here, the line is crossing at 2. And again, so let's label our point here. So if I'm looking here, I know my y-coordinate, that second point there, that's 2. But then what's my x-coordinate? Well, it's not really going left or right. It's sitting on 0. Okay? So let's try to do the next example. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to try to find the x-intercept and the y-intercept. So where that line crosses the x-axis and where it crosses the y-axis. So if I'm looking here, I'm following my line, I notice that it crosses the x-axis right here. So if I'm looking here, I see that my x value on my axes is 3. My y value is going to be 0. Okay, and again, it's 0 because if I follow this all the way back till I hit y, that's at 0. Okay? And now let's try to find my y-intercept. So I'm looking here, I see that it crosses here. Well, remember that whenever I write my ordered pairs, x's come first. So here, if I follow my x value all the way across, that's at 0, right? And my y value, my up and down value, that's at -2. Okay, so my x-intercept is going to be 3 and 0. My y-intercept is going to be 0 and -2. So let's look at this final example. And again, we're going to try to find those y and x-intercepts. So if I'm following my line across here like this, and I want to see where my line is crossing that x-axis, and remember that my x-axis is always my horizontal axis, so it goes left to right, okay? So I can see that it's crossing right here. And again, like there's no trickery here. This is not witchcraft. It is crossing here. I'm just looking with my eyes. I don't have to do any math, okay? So I'm looking here, and my coordinates, my order pair always goes my x value first, then my y value. Okay, so x, then y. So here, if I'm looking here, this is at -1. So my x value is -1. And again, I'm going to scroll over until I see what my y value is. And here, look, okay, that's at 0. So that's what I'm writing here. So my x is -1 and 0. And let's keep following that line straight upwards. And I see that it's crossing right here. And that's at 3. And if I were to try to find my x coordinate here, so I wanted to look to see where that's crossing. That's my x here. That's going to be 0, okay? So it's at 0, then positive 3. So let's just zoom out for a second here so that we can see kind of all of our x and y coordinates. What do you notice about your x-intercept? What pattern do you notice? So one of the things that you may have said is that you notice that with my x-intercept, I always have a value for my x, and y is always 0. Okay, so and y is always 0 there. For your y-intercept, what do you notice? Well, kind of the same thing. If I'm looking here, my x is 0, but my y for my y-intercept always has a value. Okay, so y. So the opposite letter for what I'm trying to find is usually 0. And x is 0. So how do you find the x-intercept? So to find the x-intercept, you look at where the line crosses the x-axis, or make y equal to 0. And what I mean here is, what if we are in the situation where I don't have a graph like this? What if I just had an equation? So if I had an equation, I know that my y is always going to equal 0. So if I substitute y equals 0 in here, solve for x, I'm going to get my x-intercept. With my y-intercept, I can look at where that line crosses the y-axis, or sub x equal to 0 into my equation. So replace x with 0 and solve for y. Okay? So if I move down here, we're going to try exactly that. I want to find the x and the y-intercepts, and then I'm going to graph the line. So I'm going to zoom in here so we have lots of room to write with, and then we will graph the line. Okay? So if I'm looking for my x-intercept, I just told you that whenever we are looking for our x-intercept, you are going to substitute y equals 0 into the equation. Because if I was looking at where that line crossed the x-axis, my y value on the graph is 0. This is why we do this. So if I have 2x minus y minus 7 equals 0, I'm going to make y 0. And then I'm going to solve for x. Okay? So this is the same thing if I replace y with 0, which is what I just did here. Okay? This is the same thing as substituting. So now I'm going to solve for x. I'm going to gather my like terms, so I'm left with 2x. 0 is just gone. That leaves me with subtract 7. Okay? And remember that this negative here, this subtract sign, applies to this 0. So now I have 2x minus 7 equals 0. And I want to get x by itself. So to get x by itself, I need to move this negative 7 across the equal sign. How do I do that? I'm going to make it positive. Okay? If I do negative 7 plus 7 on this side, it goes to 0. Whatever I do to the left-hand side, I have to do to the right. 0 plus 7 on this side is going to give me 7. Okay? And now if I'm looking at this, how do I get x by itself? If I have a 2 here, I'm going to divide. I'm going to divide both sides by 2. 2 divided by 2, that's going to cancel, leave me with x. 7 divided by 2, if you use a calculator, or maybe you just know it because you're really good with mental math, is 3.5. So what does this mean? This means that my x-intercept, if I was to write that as an ordered pair, would be 3.5 and 0. So let's go over here and let's find 3.5 on my graph. So this is my x. Oops, sorry. My bad. This is my x. Oh, goodness gracious. This is my x. Yes, yes. This is my y. And on my graph here, I'm going to go along to 3.5, and I'm going to plot a point. Okay? So now let's find our y-intercept. If I'm looking for my y-intercept, I'm going to do almost the exact same thing. But now, instead of substituting y equals 0 into the equation, I'm going to do x equals 0 because you always do the opposite letter so that you can solve for the one you're looking for. Okay? Okay, so I have 2x minus y minus 7 equals 0. Instead of an x, now I'm going to replace that with a 0. 2 times 0 is 0. That leaves me with negative y, subtract 7 equals 0. And remember what we said earlier, we always want to have a positive y. So to make this positive, to make this y positive, it's easier for me to just move that across the equal sign. Okay, so if I'm subtracting y on this side, I'm going to add it. And if I did it to the left-hand side, I now have to do it to the right-hand side. Negative y plus y, that goes to 0. So negative 7 equals y, or y equals negative 7. Okay, that should be a negative there, sorry. So what does this mean? This means that my y-intercept now, my x value is going to be 0 because that's what I substituted into the equation. My y value is negative 7. So if I'm going back to this graph, I'm going to find negative 7 on my y-axis. I'm going to draw a dot there. Now look, I have two dots. Using a ruler, you can connect them and make a straight line. So let's see if I can do that. Okay, so I was able to make that straight line, and then this is how that's going to look. And remember, key things here, I want to make sure that my line is extending through the whole graph. You may not need to have the line going all the way right here. So like if I was doing a test, you'd want to make sure that the line was not outside the grid here. That's just the software going on. But yeah, you want to make sure that the line is going through the whole grid. And remember, this is now a continuous line. It's solid. And that you've used a ruler. Grid. And then I'm connecting those 2 points. Grid. All right, so let's look at this next example. We're going to do exactly the same thing. So if we're finding the x-intercept, so to find our x-intercept, again, we are going to substitute y equals 0 because there's no y point at the x-intercept. And we're going to solve, so rearrange for x. Okay. So if I'm looking here, I have 3x minus 5y plus 15 equals 0. And instead of a y now, I'm going to replace that with a 0. And I always show that substitution by putting a bracket around the number that I'm replacing the letter with. 5 times 0 is 0. So that means I have 3x plus 15 equals 0. And now I'm going to try to rearrange so I can get x by itself. So 3x equals negative 15 because you have to subtract it to the other side. And I'm going to divide both sides by 3 now because I'm multiplying, and that's how I get rid of it. 3 divided by 3, that's going to leave me with x. Negative 15 divided by 3, that leaves me with negative 5. So my x-intercept here is going to be negative 5, and my y point is 0. Okay. So now let's do the opposite and find my y. And you're going to substitute x equals 0 into the equation. So I have 3x minus 5y plus 15 equals 0. 3 times 0, because I'm replacing my x with 0. Okay, 3 times 0 is 0. Now I'm left with negative 5y plus 15 equals 0. And again, I want to look at this because I want to make sure that I have a positive y here. So I can do one of two things. I can move the 15 over, or I can move the negative 5y over. And that's what I'm going to do just so that I always have that positive 5, or that positive y. Okay, so if I was subtracting 5y on this side, I'm adding it to the other side to make it positive, and that's what's happened here. I'm multiplying my 5 and my y together, so I need to divide to get rid of it. 5 divided by 5 leaves me with y. 15 divided by 5 leaves me with 3. And remember that this is the same thing. Saying 3 equals y or y equals 3, that's the same thing. So my y-intercept here now, I had to substitute x is 0, so my x point was 0. My y was 3. So now let's try to graph those, and then this is the last example. We won't do the other one today. So let's try to graph it. So I'm going to find -5 and 0 on my graph for my x point. Okay. So if I look over here, I'm going to go over to -5, so negative's going to go left on my graph. And at 0, so I'm going to draw my point here. And then I also had a point at 3 and 0 on my y-axis, 0 and 3, which is right here. That's my other point. And now I'm going to draw a line to connect them. So now that we have our line drawn, and again, just a reminder that this is our x, this is our y-axis. So now that we have that straight line, it's filling the whole grid, and I can see that it is a straight line. My 2 points are connected. Okay, so this is the other way that we can draw an equation of a line if we wanted to find the x and the y intercepts, and you're able to draw them both ways, but this way, being able to find the x intercepts, is a major part of grade 10 math, so that's why we show you this way now in grade 9, so that you can have an idea of what to do then. Okay, we're not going to do the next example. I think 2 is enough. Shoot me an email if you guys have any questions, and don't forget that you can always fill in those questions in that Google Doc, so just let me know how things are going, and I hope that you are staying awesome.